Sorry, you guys, I totally forgot to do the stinking screencast. And it's 9:30, so you're not going to be happy with me. Um, but here it goes. So I'm going to be talking to you tonight about a concept called fitness. And fitness may sound like the kind of fitness that you do down at the Winter X, but that is not the definition when it comes to biology. When it comes to biology, the concept of fitness has to do with reproductive ability. And so fundamentally what this means, I'll just write out the definition. All right, so there you have it. The ability to survive and reproduce so that you maximize the transfer of genes to the next generation. The important thing here is on reproduction. You can survive for a really long time, but if you don't reproduce, then you've done nothing to help your fitness. Similarly, if you only reproduce once because you don't live for very long, then you haven't done a good job of passing a lot of your genes on to the next generation as well. So this is a strange concept because it should sort of shift the paradigm of your thinking when it comes to biology. Fundamentally, the most important thing for an organism is to eat enough so that you can have sex and reproduce as much as possible. That sounds really crazy, but that is essentially what your genes drive you to do as an individual organism out there, whether you're a fungus or a tree or a human being. Now, of course, some of these things don't um, undergo sexual reproduction, but it doesn't make a difference. The concept of reproduction in general is what we're trying to go for here. That's the goal. And it is really important for you to think of this in terms of the gene and what's called by Richard Dawkins the selfish gene. And what Richard Dawkins sort of laid out here with this idea of the selfish gene is that any one gene, let's just call this gene X, okay? Any one gene wants to make sure that they pass themselves on to the next generation, because if you don't, you risk extinction. So if you want to continuously go on to generation 1 and then to generation 2 and then to generation 3, you better make sure that you as the gene are associated with a good organism that will be able to have a high level of fitness and pass this X gene on from one generation to the next. Now, how does a gene do that? It's not like it's actively thinking about it, and that's a very important thing. Genes are not sentient beings, but they don't need to be sentient beings in order for this to work, because all you need to be is a good enough gene that it stays around and is able to move from one generation to the next, because anything that's a crappy gene is going to offer something negative to the organism in which it sits, and therefore the fitness of that organism is going to be lower necessarily. And if the fitness is lower for that organism, then the chances of that gene being passed on to the next generation is lowered. So you should think of yourself as your body. Your body is simply a transport machine for all your genes. Okay, so just a transport machine. You are ruled by your genes, and you do all the things you do to maximize the number of genes that are in you right now being passed on to the next generation. So if it means that you have a gene that gives you the ability to hunt really well, that's going to do a lot to increase your fitness. If you have a gene that makes you beautiful and attractive to everybody, again, that's going to improve your fitness level. Similarly, the opposite of that is if you have a gene that makes you sickly or makes you die before you become reproductive, then that's a gene that's going to very quickly disappear. It's not going to be passed on to the next generation. So when you approach this concept from the idea of individual genes, it actually starts to make the concept of evolution make a lot more sense. Because genes, not only do they want to be associated with good things, so you accumulate a whole bunch of good genes so that the survival machine for those genes can have the highest amount of fitness, but obviously any bad gene that you have is not going to continue. And you want to make sure that you combine good genes with other good genes. And so finding a mate that is going to be a suitable mate means that the genes that you offer to the union are going to be picked up and carried along by the good genes of your mate. Now, of course, the big thing here is that whenever you reproduce sexually, the big issue you have is that only 50% of your genes are passed on to the next generation. That's a hugely bad yield. Obviously, if you were a pretty good situation, the best thing to do to maximize the number of genes that you could pass on to the next generation is to undergo asexual reproduction. But of course, the problem with that is that asexual reproduction may lead to a dead end. There's a high risk that you're going to have 100%. So let's say you do asexual reproduction, right? Or let me back up actually. Let's say that sexual reproduction gives you a 75% chance of being able to reproduce and move on to the next generation. All right, so that means 75% chance you could take if you had, let's say, 100 genes, even though you have way more than 100 genes, then that means 75 of those genes are going to be passed on from you to the next generation, so G2. Imagine then, instead of being an asexual reproducer, a sexual reproducer, you are an asexual reproducer. And if this is the case, then similar to what we have going on here, instead of having 50%, you have 100% of your genes that get passed on to the next generation. I have to go say goodnight to my daughter. Okay, I'm back from saying goodnight to Abigail. So imagine for an asexual reproducer, 100% of your genes have the potential to be passed on to the next generation. But I want you to imagine that instead of having a 75% chance of being able to reproduce, asexual reproducers only have a 50% chance, because without the ability to be variable, you may not be able to outcompete the other organisms, and your environment may change dramatically, and that's why you have a much lower percent of survival and reproduction. So if this is the case and you still have 100 genes, so 50% of 100 genes means that you're only going to be able to pass 50 genes on to the next generation, as opposed to 75 genes being passed on to generation 2. So, the numbers aren't that clean, obviously. It's there in some cases it might be beneficial to be an asexual reproducer if you're in a pretty static environment, and it might absolutely demand that you are a sexual reproducer if you're in an environment that's constantly in flux, or where there's great competition. So there you have it, the concept here of fitness and the idea of the selfish gene driving a lot of the decision making that goes on. It may be strange because it's hard for you to imagine that a gene is what's ruling you and making you make the decisions, but ultimately the collection of genes in your body are the things that fundamentally make you make the decisions and do the things and behave the way you do and look the way you look. So it all goes back to your genes, which is a little bit strange. Okay, bye.